It started with a man in a bathrobe. For years, residents of Greenwich Village saw him wandering the streets in slippers, mumbling to himself, sometimes guided by relatives who held him by the arm. To most people, he looked like a confused old man. But behind that performance was Vincent Gigante, the boss of the Genovese crime family. For nearly 3 decades, he convinced courts, psychiatrists, and even some federal investigators that he was mentally unfit. Meanwhile, he controlled one of the most disciplined and profitable criminal organizations in the United States. This is the story of the Mafia boss who hid in plain sight. Vincent Louis Gigante was born on March 29, 1928, in New York City, into a household shaped by immigration, discipline, and the tight streets of Lower Manhattan. His father, Salvatore Gigante, was a watchmaker. His mother, Yolanda Gigante, worked as a seamstress. Both had come from Naples, Italy, carrying with them language, tradition, and a strong sense of family hierarchy. They raised 5 sons in a modest apartment where money was limited, but expectations were clear. Vincent grew up alongside his brothers Mario, Pasquale, Ralph, and Louis. 3 of them would eventually follow him into organized crime. One would take a different path. Louis Gigante became a Catholic priest at St. Athanasius Church in the South Bronx, and later served on the New York City Council. The contrast inside that family would become one of the most striking elements of the Gigante story. In one household, under one roof, 2 futures were being shaped, one inside the church, the other inside the underworld. As a boy, Vincent earned the nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. His mother called him Cinzino, an affectionate variation of Vincenzo, the Italian form of Vincent. In a neighborhood where many boys were named Vincent, the shortened sound stuck. Chin. It began as a family nickname. It would become a name whispered in social clubs and federal wiretap rooms decades later. He attended public school 3 in Manhattan's West Village. Later, he enrolled at Textile High School. He did not finish. He dropped out as a teenager, stepping away from formal education and toward the streets. Manhattan in the 1930s and early 1940s was crowded, competitive, and heavily influenced by the 5 families that controlled organized crime in New York. Young men growing up in that environment learned early who held power. They saw who had money. They saw who commanded respect. By his mid-teens, Vincent Gigante was already spending time in boxing gyms. The discipline of the ring appealed to him. The structure, the hierarchy, the violence contained inside ropes. Between 1944 and 1947, he would fight professionally as a light heavyweight. But before the boxing record was written, before the mob title came decades later, he was simply another kid from Manhattan, the son of immigrants. Raised in a tight apartment, watching the city carefully, those early years mattered. They shaped his understanding of loyalty, secrecy, and survival. In the neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, reputations were currency, and Vincent Gigante was already learning how to build one. By 1944, Vincent Gigante had traded textbooks for boxing gloves. He was 16 years old, fighting out of New York under the name Chin Gigante, a nickname that had followed him from childhood. What began as his mother's affectionate pronunciation of Vincenzo now appeared on fight cards. He entered the professional ranks as a light heavyweight during the final years of World War II. Between July 18, 1944 and May 17, 1947, Gigante fought 25 professional bouts. He boxed a total of 117 rounds and lost only 4 fights. In the ring, he developed a reputation for being durable, steady, and composed under pressure. His first professional fight took place on July 18, 1944, in Union City, New Jersey, against Vic Chambers. Gigante lost that bout. It was a narrow introduction to the sport at the professional level. But he did not retreat. On October 6, 1944, at St. Nicholas Arena in Manhattan, he faced Chambers again and won. The rematch marked the beginning of a short but active career inside some of New York's most storied venues. On June 29, 1945, Gigante defeated Chambers for a 3rd time, this time at Madison Square Garden. Fighting at the Garden carried weight. It meant a fighter had earned attention. It meant promoters believed he could draw a crowd. For a young man from Manhattan streets, it was a step into a brighter spotlight. Over the next 2 years, Gigante continued building his record. He was not a national star. He was not a champion, but he was competent, disciplined, and respected within the local boxing circuit. He trained hard, fought regularly, and carried himself with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that boxing was both opportunity and escape. His final professional bout came on May 17, 1947, at Ridgewood Grove Arena in Brooklyn. That night, he faced Jimmy Slade. The fight ended in a technical knockout loss for Gigante. It was his last appearance as a professional fighter. He was 19 years old. The boxing career lasted 3 years. It gave him structure. It introduced him to men who moved between gyms and social clubs, between legal competition and illegal enterprise. In New York during the 1940s, boxing and organized crime often overlapped. Fighters needed managers needed protection. The line between sport and street was thin. When Gigante stepped out of the ring in 1947, he did not step into retirement. He stepped into another arena, one without referees, one without time limits, and this time the consequences would reach far beyond the ropes. When Vincent Gigante left boxing in 1947, he did not drift. He moved with direction. The gyms had introduced him to men who lived comfortably on cash that did not come from punches thrown under bright lights. In post-war New York, the lines between boxing managers, bookmakers, and mafia captains often blurred. Gigante began spending less time in the ring and more time in social clubs where power was measured differently. By his late teens, he had come under the influence of Vito Genovese, then a powerful Caporegime in what was still known as the Luciano crime family. Genovese was ambitious, disciplined, and feared. He had already built a reputation as one of the most formidable figures in organized crime. According to accounts from the period, Genovese helped pay for surgery for Gigante's mother, Yolanda. That kind of gesture carried weight. It created loyalty. Gigante became one of Genovese's protégés. The relationship was not casual. In that world, mentorship meant obedience. It meant proving reliability. It meant carrying out orders without hesitation. Between the ages of 17 and 25, Gigante was arrested 7 times. The charges included receiving stolen goods, possession of an unlicensed handgun, illegal gambling, and bookmaking. Most of those cases were dismissed or resolved with fines. One resulted in a 60-day jail sentence for a gambling conviction. During this period, when asked about his employment, Gigante often listed his occupation as a tailor. On paper, the record looked scattered. In reality, it marked the early stages of an apprenticeship. He was learning how the system worked, how cases were handled, how silence was maintained, and who could be counted on. Within the Luciano family, Gigante functioned as an enforcer. That role required physical presence and discipline. He collected debts. He applied pressure when payments slowed. He represented the authority of his captain in neighborhoods where disputes could turn violent quickly. Those years built his reputation internally. He was not loud, he was not flashy, he was dependable. By the mid-1950s, the Luciano family itself was shifting. Charles Lucky Luciano had been deported years earlier. Frank Costello held power, but Vito Genovese wanted that power back. And when Genovese decided to move against Costello, he chose a young man he trusted to carry out the order. Vincent "Chin" Gigante had spent nearly a decade preparing for that moment. By the spring of 1957, the balance of power inside the Luciano crime family was unstable. Frank Costello, the acting boss, had held control for years. Vito Genovese wanted it back. The disagreement was not public. It never would be. In that world, leadership changed quietly, often with a single gunshot. On the evening of May 2nd, 1957, Frank Costello returned to his apartment building at 115 Central Park West, known as the Majestic. He had been out to dinner with his wife and friends. As he approached the entrance, Vincent Gigante was waiting. Gigante was armed with a .38 caliber handgun. According to court records and witness accounts, as Costello entered the lobby, Gigante called out to him. Costello began to turn, the gun fired, the bullet grazed the side of Costello's head. It was not a fatal wound, it was close enough to send a message. Costello collapsed but survived. The gunman fled, believing the job may have been finished. It was not. Police launched a large investigation. The building's doorman described the shooter as a stocky man around 6 feet tall. Eventually, Vincent Gigante was identified and arrested. The case moved toward trial in 1958. The prosecution faced a problem that was common in organized crime cases of that era. The victim would not cooperate. In court, Frank Costello stated that he could not identify his attacker. When asked directly who shot him, he said he did not know. Without the victim's testimony confirming the identification, the case weakened. Gigante was acquitted of attempted murder in 1958. The outcome changed the structure of the family. Costello understood the message. He relinquished power soon afterward and retired from active leadership. Vito Genovese assumed control of what would formally become known as the Genovese crime family. For Vincent Gigante, the failed assassination did not end his career. It strengthened his position. He had carried out Genovese's most critical order. He had been arrested, he had stood trial, and he had walked out free. Inside that organization, loyalty was measured in actions. On May 2, 1957, Gigante proved where he stood. In 1959, the federal government struck back at the leadership of the Genovese crime family. Vito Genovese, now the boss after Frank Costello's retirement, was indicted on heroin trafficking charges. Vincent Gigante was charged alongside him. The case marked a turning point. For the first time, Gigante faced a serious federal conviction that would not disappear with a fine or a dismissed complaint. Both men were convicted in federal court in 1959. Genovese received a lengthy sentence. Gigante was sentenced to 7 years in prison. It was the most significant penalty of his life up to that point. The man who had walked free after shooting Frank Costello now entered the federal system as a convicted narcotics trafficker. Gigante served 5 years before being paroled. Prison altered the structure of the family outside. Genovese's imprisonment weakened centralized control and the organization adjusted. Inside the prison system, alliances formed and loyalties hardened. When Gigante was released in the mid-1960s, he returned to a family that valued proven men, especially those who had kept silent. Not long after his release, Gigante was promoted from soldier to Caporegime, or captain. He was given control of the Greenwich Village crew. The crew operated out of the Triangle Civic Improvement Association, a social club that functioned as both neighborhood fixture and operational headquarters. As captain, Gigante supervised soldiers and associates, collected tribute, and managed expanding revenue streams. His operations moved deeper into bookmaking and loan sharking. Gambling networks stretched through Manhattan neighborhoods. Debts were issued, collected, and enforced. He developed influence in labor racketeering, particularly in construction and trucking, where union relationships could determine who received contracts and who did not. The 1960s were a period of quiet growth for Gigante. He did not seek publicity. He did not cultivate flash. He built steady control. His crew generated income through extortion tied to construction projects, trucking companies, and labor peace agreements. Businesses seeking smooth operations often paid for that stability. During this period, his personal life expanded as well. He married Olympia Gripper in 1950 and they raised 5 children: Andrew, Salvatore, Yolanda, Roseanne, and Rita. At the same time, he maintained a second household with Olympia Esposito, with whom he had 3 more children: Vincent, Lucia, and Carmela. He lived in Old Tappan, New Jersey, but frequently stayed at his mother's apartment in Greenwich Village, keeping himself physically close to the neighborhood he controlled. By the late 1960s, Vincent "Chin" Gigante was no longer simply a loyal enforcer. He was a captain with a profitable crew, strong internal loyalty, and growing influence inside the Genovese crime family. The federal conviction had not weakened him. It had tested him, And in that world, surviving prison without cooperating only strengthened a man's standing. By 1969, Vincent Gigante was an established captain in the Genovese crime family. His operations in Manhattan were profitable, his crew loyal, but law enforcement pressure followed him across the Hudson River. That year, Gigante was indicted in New Jersey for conspiracy to bribe the 5-member Old Tappan Police Department. Prosecutors alleged that members of the local police force had tipped him off about surveillance activity. The charge suggested coordination at a level that could expose him to serious prison time. This time, Gigante did not rely on silence from witnesses. He relied on something else. His attorneys presented psychiatric evaluations to the court, arguing that he was mentally unfit to stand trial. Doctors diagnosed him with schizophrenia, paranoid type, describing periodic acute episodes that required hospitalization. The court accepted the findings. The charges were dropped. It marked the beginning of a strategy that would define the next 3 decades of his life. From 1969 forward, Gigante began establishing a documented history of psychiatric treatment. According to later court records, he was hospitalized repeatedly for mental health evaluations. His primary treating psychiatrist, Eugene D'Adamo, would testify that Gigante had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and suffered from episodes requiring institutional care. Defense lawyers and family members maintained that he had a below-normal IQ, reportedly measured between 69 and 72, and had been mentally impaired since the late 1960s. At the same time, neighbors in Greenwich Village began noticing something unusual. Gigante would walk the streets in a bathrobe and slippers. He mumbled to himself. He appeared disoriented. Sometimes he wandered aimlessly. Sometimes he was guided by relatives or associates who held him by the arm. To some, it looked like illness. To federal agents, it looked deliberate. Inside the Genovese family, operations continued smoothly. Gigante attended meetings, he gave instructions through intermediaries, he maintained discipline within his crew. The public image of confusion contrasted sharply with the private reports from informants who described him as lucid and focused during internal discussions. The pattern repeated through the 1970s. When legal trouble surfaced, psychiatric documentation followed, hospital admissions increased, evaluations accumulated. The foundation for a long-term incompetency defense was being laid carefully, piece by piece. What began in 1969 as a courtroom maneuver became institutionalized. The insanity claim was no longer a temporary shield. It was evolving into policy, and it would buy him time. Through the 1970s, Vincent "Chin" Gigante rarely appeared in headlines. That was by design. While other figures in organized crime drew attention with public feuds and flashy reputations, Gigante cultivated something quieter. Control without visibility. By this time, the Genovese crime family had already developed a reputation as the most disciplined of New York's 5 families. Its structure was tight, its leadership cautious. Philip "Benny Squint" Lombardo was the official boss, having taken control after Vito Genovese's imprisonment in 1959. Lombardo valued secrecy above all else. Under his leadership, the family avoided the internal wars and public violence that weakened rival organizations. Gigante fit naturally into that model. As a Caporegime based in Greenwich Village, he oversaw a profitable crew involved in bookmaking, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and construction-related extortion. His influence extended into trucking operations, garbage hauling, shipping interests, and union-controlled job sites. The family profited from companies seeking labor peace or access to union contracts, including carpenters, teamsters, and laborers' unions. Control over these sectors meant steady revenue. It also meant leverage. During these years, Gigante deepened his influence quietly. He held meetings at the Triangle Civic Improvement Association in Manhattan. He avoided telephones, he spoke softly in person. According to later FBI accounts, he was nearly impossible to capture clearly on wiretaps. Even when agents planted listening devices, conversations were coded. His name was rarely spoken. When it had to be referenced, members pointed to their chins or formed the letter C with their fingers. The public image remained consistent. He wandered Greenwich Village in pajamas and a bathrobe, mumbling to himself. Law enforcement agents watched him shuffle through the neighborhood and recorded the scenes. The performance of instability continued. Inside the organization, however, there was no confusion about who held authority. By the late 1970s, Philip Lombardo's health was declining. His grip on day-to-day operations weakened. Within the family, attention turned toward succession. Gigante had seniority, credibility, and the trust of key captains. He had survived prison without cooperating. He had maintained profitable rackets. He had proven loyalty dating back to the attempted hit on Frank Costello. Informants later told federal investigators that by the end of the decade, Gigante was already exercising de facto control over significant family decisions. Lombardo remained the official boss, but authority increasingly flowed through Gigante's circle. There were no public announcements, no ceremonies. Power shifted in quiet rooms through quiet conversations. By 1981, when Lombardo formally stepped down due to poor health, the transition required no violence and no internal dispute. Vincent "Chin" Gigante was ready. He had spent a decade consolidating influence without drawing the spotlight. And now he would step fully into control while making sure the spotlight stayed somewhere else. By 1981, the transition inside the Genovese crime family was complete. Philip "Benny Squint" Lombardo stepped down as boss due to failing health. With Lombardo's backing, Vincent "Chin" Gigante assumed control of the most secretive of New York's 5 families. There was no public declaration. In that world, power moved quietly. But inside the organization, there was no confusion. Gigante was the boss. What made his ascension different was how he chose to structure it. Rather than occupy the visible position at the top, Gigante installed Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno as front boss. Salerno was a longtime Genovese captain who operated out of the Palmer Boys Social Club in East Harlem. He was respected, seasoned, and well known to law enforcement. To federal investigators, Salerno appeared to be the head of the family. That perception was intentional. Gigante remained behind the curtain, directing major decisions while Salerno absorbed attention from prosecutors and the FBI. The arrangement allowed Gigante to preserve distance between himself and the day-to-day exposure that came with leadership. It also preserved the image he had been cultivating for more than a decade, the image of a man whose mental instability made him incapable of running a criminal empire. Internally, discipline tightened. Members of the Genovese family were forbidden from speaking Gigante's name in conversations or on telephones. Even in private discussions, caution governed speech. The family already had a reputation for secrecy. Under Gigante, that reputation hardened into policy. He avoided telephones entirely. He spoke softly in person. At times, he even whistled into receivers rather than speak when he suspected surveillance. He rarely left his home unattended, aware that federal agents might attempt to plant listening devices. Meetings were conducted through layers of insulation. Orders flowed downward through trusted intermediaries. Captains communicated with soldiers. Messages passed carefully, orally, and often indirectly. The structure created plausible deniability at every level. During the early and mid-1980s, the Genovese family expanded its reach in labor racketeering, construction, trucking, and garbage hauling. The family exerted influence over contracts connected to major projects, including operations tied to the Javits Center. They extracted protection payments from merchants at the Fulton Fish Market and operated gambling games during the Feast of San Gennaro in Little Italy, skimming donations meant for a neighborhood church until city officials intervened in 1995. While Salerno appeared in surveillance photos and was eventually indicted as boss during the 1986 Mafia Commission trial, Gigante remained officially in the background. When Salerno received a 100-year sentence in 1987, it became clear to investigators that something did not add up. Informant Vincent "the Fish" Cafaro later told the FBI that Salerno had been acting as a front since 1969. But by then, Gigante had already cemented control. He had created a model of leadership built on invisibility. A boss who could not be quoted, a boss whose name could not be spoken, a boss who appeared to wander the streets in a bathrobe while directing one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country. In the underworld, visibility invites attack. Gigante chose the opposite path, and for a time, it worked. By the mid-1980s, the balance of power in New York's underworld was shifting again. In December 1985, Gambino crime family boss Paul Castellano was murdered outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan on orders of his own captain, John Gotti. The killing was carried out without formal approval from the Mafia Commission, the governing body of the five families. For leaders who valued structure and order, it was an act of defiance. Vincent "Chin" Gigante took it personally. According to federal testimony and later court findings, Gigante supported retaliation. On April 13, 1986, a car bomb exploded in Brooklyn, killing Frank DeCicco, the Gambino family underboss and a close ally of John Gotti. The explosion occurred after DeCicco visited James Failer, a Castellano loyalist. The bomb had reportedly been planted under a vehicle in anticipation of Gotti's arrival, but Gotti did not enter the car that day. DeCicco did. He died at the scene. The bombing was carried out by members of the Lucchese crime family, including Victor Amuzzo and Anthony Casso, under orders tied to Lucchese boss Anthony Corallo and Gigante. The objective was clear: restore order, send a message, reinforce the authority of the commission. The violence unfolded while federal prosecutors were building a historic case. In 1985 and 1986, the government indicted top leaders of the five families in what became known as the Mafia Commission trial. Anthony "Fat Tony" Salerno was charged and publicly identified as the boss of the Genovese crime family. In January 1987, Salerno was sentenced to 100 years in prison for racketeering, alongside other major figures. On paper, the commission trial appeared to decapitate organized crime leadership in New York. In reality, one of the most powerful men in the city had avoided the indictment entirely. That illusion began to crack when Vincent "the Fish" Cafaro, a longtime Genovese member and close associate of Salerno, turned government witness. Cafaro told the FBI that Salerno had not been the true boss. He described him as a front. The real authority, Cafaro explained, had been Vincent Gigante. Wiretaps captured conversations reinforcing the point. In one recorded exchange, Salerno reviewed potential candidates for induction into another family and deferred decisions to the boss. The identity behind that word was becoming clearer to investigators. Even so, Gigante remained insulated. He continued his routine in Greenwich Village, wandering in a bathrobe and slippers. He avoided telephones. He rarely allowed direct contact. His name was not spoken openly inside the family. Orders flowed through intermediaries. In 1992, John Gotti was convicted in federal court on racketeering and murder charges and sentenced to life in prison. With Gotti behind bars, the most visible and flamboyant mafia boss of the era was removed from power. Attention shifted. By the early 1990s, law enforcement and organized crime observers widely regarded Vincent Gigante as the most powerful crime boss in the United States. The position of Capo di Tutti Capi, boss of all bosses, had technically been abolished decades earlier after the murder of Salvatore Maranzano in 1931. But in practice, Gigante's influence across the commission and within his own family placed him at the top of the hierarchy. He had reached that position without press conferences, without public bravado, and without visible confrontation. The man who appeared confused on city sidewalks was directing strategy at the highest levels of organized crime, and the federal government was still trying to prove it. By 1990, federal prosecutors had spent years building a case designed to reach beyond street-level operators and into the structure of the Genovese crime family itself. The opportunity came through an investigation into bid rigging involving the New York City Housing Authority. Between 1978 and 1990, 4 of New York's 5 families had secretly controlled approximately 75% of the city's public housing window installation contracts. The total value of those contracts was around $191 million. Companies awarded the jobs were required to pay union kickbacks, typically between $1 and $2 per window installed. The scheme generated millions in illicit revenue. On May 30th, 1990, Vincent "Chin" Gigante was indicted in Brooklyn federal court alongside several other organized crime figures. Prosecutors alleged that he oversaw the window installation racket and other racketeering activities as head of the Genovese family. Gigante arrived at his arraignment wearing pajamas and a bathrobe. The image was familiar by then. For more than 2 decades, he had cultivated the persona of a mentally unstable man wandering Greenwich Village. Now that persona became the centerpiece of his defense. His attorneys argued that he was mentally and physically incapable of standing trial. They presented psychiatric evaluations dating back to 1969. Doctors testified that he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and organic brain damage. Records showed that from 1969 through the mid-1990s, Gigante had been hospitalized numerous times for psychiatric treatment. His lawyers maintained that he could not meaningfully understand court proceedings. What followed were years of competency hearings. The trial stalled as federal judges weighed conflicting medical testimony. Prosecutors contended that the insanity was an act. The defense insisted it was genuine. In June 1993, while the window case was still unresolved, Gigante was indicted again. This time, the charges were broader and more severe. He was accused of sanctioning the murders of 6 mobsters and conspiring to kill 3 others. Among the alleged targets was John Gotti, the Gambino boss who had already been convicted and imprisoned in 1992. The government's case gained momentum when former high-ranking mobsters began cooperating. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, former underboss of the Gambino crime family who had turned government witness in 1991, testified during sanity hearings in 1996. Gravano told the court that he had attended meetings with Gigante at the highest levels of organized crime. According to Gravano, Gigante was lucid, focused, and fully aware during those discussions. He described a man who strategically discussed business and authority, not someone disconnected from reality. Alphonse "Little Al" D'Arco, former acting boss of the Lucchese crime family, who also became a cooperating witness, offered similar testimony. He stated that Gigante had privately acknowledged that his bizarre public behavior was deliberate. The prosecution argued that the bathrobe walks, the muttering, and the hospitalizations were calculated tactics designed to obstruct justice. They presented evidence that Gigante appeared coherent and decisive in private settings while presenting confusion only in public or legal contexts. In August 1996, senior judge Eugene Nickerson of the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York issued a critical ruling. After years of delay, he declared Vincent Gigante mentally competent to stand trial. The decision pierced the shield Gigante had relied on for nearly 3 decades. For the first time, the performance would no longer stop the courtroom from moving forward. By the summer of 1997, after years of delay, the case against Vincent "Chin" Gigante finally reached a jury. The trial began on June 25, 1997, in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York. Gigante entered the courtroom in a wheelchair. He appeared frail. He muttered. At times, he seemed disconnected from the proceedings. His attorneys maintained that he was unable to understand the charges against him. Prosecutors argued that the performance was deliberate. Over the course of the trial, jurors heard testimony describing the internal structure of the Genovese crime family, the window installation bid-rigging scheme, and Gigante's alleged role in authorizing violence against rival mob figures. Cooperating witnesses detailed how orders flowed downward from him through layers of insulation. On July 25, 1997, after nearly 3 days of deliberations, the jury returned a verdict. Vincent Gigante was convicted of racketeering and conspiracy to commit murder. For federal prosecutors, it was a decisive moment. After decades of evasion, the man they believed to be the most powerful mafia leader in the country had been found guilty. Sentencing took place on December 18, 1997. Judge Jack B. Weinstein imposed a 12-year federal prison term and a $1.25 million fine. In explaining the sentence, Weinstein referenced Gigante's age and frailty, but made clear that the conviction marked the end of what he described as decades of criminal dominance. Gigante was sent to federal prison. Yet incarceration did not immediately sever his influence. According to prosecutors and later court filings, he continued to relay messages to the Genovese family from behind bars. The conduit was his son, Andrew Gigante, who visited him regularly. Through Andrew, orders and guidance allegedly flowed back to captains and associates on the outside. The structure he had built, layered and insulated, did not collapse with his imprisonment. Federal authorities took notice. On January the 23rd, 2002, Gigante was indicted again, this time on charges of racketeering and obstruction of justice. Prosecutors alleged that he had continued to oversee family operations from prison and that he had deliberately feigned mental illness for years to delay his earlier trial. The indictment also named Andrew Gigante and several other associates, accusing them of facilitating communication and helping sustain the deception. The government's position was direct. The insanity defense had not been confusion. It had been strategy. By 2002, Vincent Gigante was no longer the invisible boss on the streets of Greenwich Village. He was an aging inmate in federal custody. But the question facing prosecutors remained the same as it had for decades. Had the act finally ended, or was it still being performed behind prison walls? By 2003, the performance that had shielded Vincent "Chin" Gigante for more than 3 decades was collapsing under the weight of evidence. On January the 23rd, 2002, federal prosecutors had indicted him again, charging him with obstruction of justice and racketeering. The accusation was blunt. They alleged that Gigante had deliberately faked mental illness to delay and derail his earlier prosecution. They also charged that he continued to influence the Genovese crime family from prison, using his son Andrew Gigante as a messenger. Federal prosecutor Roslyn R. Mousekopf prepared to present taped conversations that, according to the government, showed Gigante speaking clearly, coherently, and strategically while incarcerated. The recordings were meant to demonstrate that the confusion displayed in courtrooms and on Greenwich Village sidewalks had been calculated. On April 7, 2003, just hours before the obstruction trial was set to begin, Gigante pleaded guilty. In open court, he admitted that he had feigned mental illness for decades in order to avoid prosecution. It was one of the most extraordinary admissions by a mafia boss in modern American history. For years, his lawyers had argued schizophrenia, dementia, organic brain damage. His brother, Father Louis Gigante, had publicly defended his mental condition. Hospital records had documented repeated psychiatric admissions between 1969 and 1995. Now, the architect of the strategy acknowledged it had been a ruse. Judge Leo Glasser sentenced him to an additional 3 years in federal prison. The plea agreement included provisions designed to protect certain family members from further prosecution connected to the deception. The consequences extended to his son. On July 25, 2003, Andrew Gigante was sentenced to 2 years in prison and fined $2.5 million for racketeering and extortion. Prosecutors had alleged that Andrew helped relay messages from his father to family members and associates while Gigante was incarcerated. By this stage, Vincent Gigante was an elderly man in declining health. He had a documented history of heart disease. He had undergone open-heart surgery in 1988 and another cardiac operation in December 1996. While in federal custody, he experienced breathing difficulties and episodes of fainting. His lawyers at one point secured a court order allowing him temporary treatment outside the prison medical unit due to respiratory issues. He was ultimately housed at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. The facility also housed other high-profile inmates, including former Gambino boss John Gotti, who had died there in 2002. On December 19, 2005, Vincent Louis Gigante died at the age of 77. Federal officials cited heart disease as the cause of death. 4 days later, on December 23, 2005, his funeral was held at St. Anthony of Padua Church in Greenwich Village. The service was conducted largely without public spectacle. His life had spanned more than 50 years inside organized crime. He had risen from neighborhood boxer to captain, from captain to boss, from visible defendant to invisible ruler. For nearly 30 years, he convinced courts, psychiatrists, neighbors, and even some investigators that he was a man detached from reality. In the end, the confession in 2003 stripped away the illusion. What remained was a record, a documented history of calculated deception, structured power, and a criminal empire sustained through silence and distance. The bathrobe, the muttering, the shuffling walks through Greenwich Village, they were not signs of weakness. They were strategy.